Before we begin this episode, let's take a quick look at the early airline industry. In the early 1920s, the fixed-wing aviation industry was born originally with airmail services by the early carriers, such as Northwest, Pan Am, TWA, Braniff, and Eastern. All of the original airline versions endured to the 1980s and 1990s. Of the original 7, only 2 still operate today, American and Delta. Limited passenger service, some schedule began with those early air operator pioneers in the late 1920s and well into the 1930s. As the U.S. moved into World War II, aviation was focused on the war with limited passenger service domestically. After World War II, Allied nations met in Chicago to determine how air operators would be managed after the war. These pre-World War II airlines were not organized as we understand them by today's standards. Safety was expected, but the airline's designs were rudimentary. Basic understanding of seating, safety harnessing, and cargo loading were just starting to mature. Aviation specifically, the carrying of airmail and passenger services, were in their infancy. Airlines were building trust, not just in themselves, but in the airframe's integrity, the engine's reliability, even propeller modifications, all of which made later technical strides during World War II. For the federal government, the Air Commerce Act of 1926 created an aeronautical branch of the Department of Commerce. In 1934, this branch became 2 branches, the Civil Aeronautics Administration, the CAA, and the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB. In 1958, the 2 separate branches were merged into the Federal Aviation Administration, now known as the FAA, which took from the CAA its air traffic control responsibilities and from the CAB regulatory control. The FAA has remained intact since 1958. In 1967, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, was created to conduct accident investigations, not just for aviation, but for pipeline, marine, highway, and rail. The FAA and the NTSB were in full operation throughout the 1970s when something came into being that had more of an impact on aviation than anything up to that time. The Deregulation Act of 1978. Also known as the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, or the ADA. After that, nothing was ever to be the same again. I'm not here to argue the pros and cons of airline deregulation. At this point in time, almost 50 years later, it's a reality. This episode, number 16, was supposed to be the first of 4 analyses episodes. However, as I've learned teaching FAA inspectors for 10 years, sometimes you have to go back to the beginning in order to analyze 4 accidents' causes with clarity. I decided to cover some aviation history that I feel is important to understand. So let's take a moment and go back to the 1970s and see what all that hubbub was about concerning deregulation. Hello, I'm Stephen Carbone, and this is By Reason of Air Safety. From a business standpoint, deregulation was the right direction at a time when commercial aviation had outgrown its industry. One of the drawbacks of regulation was that the federal government subsidies helped airlines of old survive. The federal government reimbursed airlines for financial losses incurred by recognizing and flying into smaller markets. In other words, airlines didn't have to strategize to capture those markets. The federal government entitled them. A positive aspect of the ADA was that it allowed airlines to set their own fares and route structures. It forced the airlines to be competitive. It removed the airline's dependency on government subsidies. Many will argue, even today, that the ADA was the end of the airlines and that the cons far outweighed the pros. This podcast episode isn't about the ADA's yays or nays. It's about the effects the ADA had on the airline industry and how aviation safety may have benefited, but mostly suffered, by the ADA's hidden consequences. For the flying public, the ADA was great news. Airlines at the time commented. Delta Airlines said the ADA was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Perhaps, but not as the article suggested. The wolf was the consequence of change. It would take years to see the insane problems that came from deregulation before the wolf shed its woolen costume. Aviation experts and other defeatists warned of the destruction of airlines as we know them. To a point, they were somewhat right. There are always consequences to change. The greater the change, the greater the consequences. But the ADA was like every bit of legislation introduced by the U.S. Congress. It was poorly planned, and its repercussions were impossible to anticipate. Worse, no one tried to anticipate anything. They just opened Pandora's box and stepped away. When the ADA became law, regulatory and investigatory agencies were blind. They were still blind to the ramifications of the ADA. As we'll see in future accident analyses, the FAA and the NTSB were deluded into believing industry would just adapt. It didn't. In 1964, 14 years before the ADA became law, the Federal Aviation Regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations, CFRs, started to change when views of design, maintenance, and inspection evolved. The air operator and certification regulations started to reflect these new concepts. Changes in how air operators, like airlines, viewed how they operated and maintained their fleets led to modifications in mindsets. As it turned out, the ADA was inevitable. The question was, could the various players survive? The consequences weren't from the ADA itself. Instead, the industry, partially out of fear, overachieved as they underanticipated. New airlines sprang up with eyes on profits, but nothing on substance. Regulatory challenges, specifically in the FAA's ability to conduct oversight and surveillance, went unconfronted. To be fair, the FAA was understaffed and untrained for what was happening. There was no one in place at the FAA or anywhere who had experience with this concept of deregulation. The FAA would miss signs. Just as the FAA got close to getting in front of one industry, the rules changed somewhere else. Instead of phasing deregulation in, it was all too much, too soon. Like any other industry, the airlines, new and old, had to earn the flying public's business. Because of this new challenge, the airline industry responded in at least 6 different ways. For one, there were low-cost airlines. The advent of low-fare, quick-turn airlines revolutionized the industry by competing directly with pre-deregulation established legacy airlines. 2. Mergers. With the dawn of low-cost airlines, mergers were an unavoidable reality. 3. International travel. The increase in international travel led to an expansion of regulatory needs. The increase in international operators increased surveillance problems, such as keeping an eye on airlines flying outside of the FAA's jurisdiction. 4. Air cargo from long haul to overnight. Heavy freight airlines like Flying Tiger and Seaboard World inspired a new business concept soon to be occupied by overnight airlines like Federal Express and UPS. 5. Growth of repair stations. Finding ways to cut costs, especially in maintenance, dictated survival. Repair stations and maintenance providers grew in unprecedented ways. Where air operators were once maintenance independent, post-deregulation maintenance became a necessary evil. And 6. Introduction of regional operators. The major airlines flew large airliners. It was not cost effective to maintain flights into smaller market routes. However, these markets were going untapped, so as businesses expanded into cities once thought too small to serve, the major airlines saw a necessity. Since airlines now had control of routes and ticket prices, a new breed of airline arose, the low-cost airline. In many cases, these low-cost air operators were flashes in the pan, with a rapid rise to popularity. But without an established safety culture combined with overly ambitious plans, many fell along the way. And yet these short-lived, low-cost airlines made long-term impacts, clearing the field of weaker, unimaginative legacy airlines that struggled to compete in an industry they no longer understood. Among these upstart, low-cost airlines, there were success stories, such as Southwest Airlines, unfortunate failures, such as People's Express, and those that failed because they grew too fast, like ValueJet. Unlike King Kong, it wasn't beauty that killed the beast. It really was the airplanes. Low-cost airlines, or the LCAs, in order to stake their claim, were driven to the point of desperation. They bought older, less reliable aircraft. These older aircraft needed more costly maintenance. Maintenance programs couldn't reconcile with the LCA's operations. And 4, poor training led to costly safety incidents by operations ramp crews. In order to remain competitive, LCAs tried to schedule flights like the legacy airlines did, but without the discipline. LCAs had little operational experience. Growth was fast, unmanageable. They couldn't keep airplanes in the air to keep up with ticket sales. Many LCAs never stopped to look back, to step back, and took the time to learn the industry. In the same way, the FAA was always running to catch up. The FAA learned from the ValueJet 592 accident later that operators didn't self-police their own growth. Instead, they relied on the FAA to do it for them. Lessons the FAA learned were short-lived. Maintenance became more than a necessary evil. Requirements like required training didn't meet the quality expected, and the LCAs were trying to sell penthouse seats at basement prices. And the LCA's aircraft and operations couldn't meet the expectations, and at some point, the money ran out. Some LCAs went bankrupt or couldn't honor their leases. They went under or were taken over. And today, what's left is Southwest Airlines and some newer upstarts that, building on past LCA failures, did things right, learning from the ashes of others. In 1987, FedEx's CEO predicted what airlines were still going to be flying at the turn of the century. His predictions were spot on. There were 2 ways a failing airline would exit from the Post-Deregulation Act airline industry. One was to fold, sell off the airplanes, and shut the doors. The second was to merge with another airline. For those of us who have been through mergers, it's a unique experience. Mergers were, in many cases, the last resort. Some were somewhat harmonious. The work groups were aware of the consequences of not merging and worked to get along. But the majority of mergers were adversarial. The combining of seniority lists was taken personally. Where a pilot landed on the combined seniority list affected what airplanes they flew, where, what routes they were able to hold, and their pay. Where a mechanic fell on the seniority list affected where they lived, pay, overtime, and road trips. Merging was not seen by the workforce as the answer, and it became very adversarial. For the FAA, the concerns with safety were often unseen. For instance, tracking maintenance requirements such as airworthiness directives could become compromised if the 2 merging airlines maintenance recording systems couldn't accurately communicate with each other. Airplanes flew for years without required maintenance performed on them. Work actions brought about by unions or disgruntled employees led to safety problems. Often airline management irresponsibly dismissed the problems, let employees fight them out, which damaged the safety cultures and thus the safety. Despite being well established when the Airline Deregulation Act was signed, international travel was becoming problematic in more obvious ways. On the passenger side, Pan Am and TWA were the international airlines of choice through the 1960s and well into the 1970s. Other U.S. certificated major airlines such as United and American had been investing into more international markets. This was and remains a slow process. But the international markets, unlike the domestic markets, were very different battlefields. The majors and a few low-cost airlines breaking into these international markets now competed with other countries' airlines. Worse, these international operators were long established and/or had government financial support. Soon, large problems became unavoidable. Many international airlines with little to no regulatory oversight by their home country were flying into the United States. These international operators weren't open to scrutiny by the FAA and vice versa until a Colombian airliner Avianca Flight 52 crashed in Cove Neck, New York on January 25, 1990. In this area, the FAA eventually prevailed. While the NTSB chased fuel starvation, the FAA pursued a more aggressive game plan, preventing catastrophic safety issues from taking place in the U.S., problems ignored by other countries' regulatory agencies. This problem facing international travel wasn't limited to one country. There were safety failures across the globe waiting to happen. To proactively prevent such tragedies from getting out of hand and out of control, the FAA worked with foreign regulatory agencies to bring forth the International Aviation Safety Assessment, the IASA program, which brought about the International Civil Aviation Organization's own contribution, the Universal Safety Oversight Audit Program, also known as USOAP. These programs ensured all countries decide what airlines can fly within their borders or in their airspace, known as the freedoms of the air. It also allowed these countries to audit and inspect airliners on their soil and work with other countries to improve each other's aviation safety. The aviation safety problems the FAA faced with air cargo in the 1970s differed dramatically from passenger airlines. Cargo airlines were supplemental operators in pre-ADA days. Charters and leases were the norm. The cargo aircraft were accessible to the FAA. The flight crews were accessible to the FAA. The mechanics and inspectors were accessible to the FAA. Better still, the FAA's Monday through Friday 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. schedule still allowed a clear picture of the cargo operator. Federal Express, introduced in the early 1970s, and UPS in 1980, created a new headache for the FAA in conflicting schedules. The FAA to this day is a 5-day-a-week, Monday through Friday agency. Most federal agencies are. Federal Express, later FedEx, and UPS started as night operations. The planes arrived for sorting at 11 p.m. and departed around 4 a.m. local time, Monday night through Saturday morning. The planes and pilots were not at the ramp when the FAA office opened. Few mechanics were on site during the day, and FAA schedules are soon modified to meet the flights, but the disconnect couldn't be fixed entirely. Outstations had to be audited and surveilled. Now, with passenger airlines posed little to no problems because the FAA inspector could board a passenger flight and reach the outstation to meet whoever he or she needed to. But cargo operation surveillance took years to work out. the government's inflexibility for inspector availability, and years of acclimating passenger oversight techniques to all cargo operations were not a sure fit. Eventually, the FAA worked out the problems with scheduling. Air cargo operators were properly overseen, but the air cargo industry's unique needs took a while for the FAA to understand how to manage their certificates. Quite truthfully, the airline industry itself failed air cargo by not recognizing its place, and the NTSB continues to ignore the commonalities of air cargo operators' fleets. Of the 6 airline deregulation topics I'm addressing here, the next 2, repair stations and regional airlines, will be the foundation of the next 4 episodes of By Reason of Air Safety, specifically why the root causes of Brit Airways Flight 2574, Air Midwest 5481, Colgan 9446, Colgan 3407, and the PSA American Eagle 5342's collision with the Black Hawk helicopter over the Potomac resulted from FAA, NTSB, and eventually congressional ignorance of repair station responsibilities and a fundamental dismissal of the regional airline industry. The Civil Aeronautics Administration, the CAA, introduced repair stations as early as 1937. Repair stations were rated to work on components, engines, and airframes under Civil Aviation Regulation CAR 52. Today, repair stations, maintenance providers, and overhaul facilities are regulated under Title 14 CFR Part 145. Before the Airline Deregulation Act, repair stations were limited in size and capability. This was for no other reason than airlines accomplished 90 to 95% of their own maintenance. Since the Airline Deregulation Act was signed, the numbers have reversed. Part 145 entities now accomplish 90 to 95% of maintenance for all airlines, domestic and international. When operating as a maintenance provider to air operators, the repair stations follow CFRs 121 subpart Lima and 135 subpart Juliet for the Air Operators Maintenance Program, called the Air Operators Continuous Airworthiness Maintenance Program, or the CAMP. To define, 1, it is the air operators' manuals that must be followed. 2, the air operator is responsible for all maintenance conducted by the repair station. 3, the air operator must be available at all times for assistance. 4, the air operator provides all training, and so on. All of these elements are part of the airline's CAMP. As we will discuss in the next 4 episodes, the FAA had difficulty being proactive with the repair stations of all sizes and complexity. The evolution from small component repairs to heavy phase maintenance, both domestic and international, was because repair stations grew quickly and under the radar. Repair stations ignored their self-auditing and put those efforts on the FAA. Regional airlines were operated before the ADA came into existence. The term regional has more than one connotation. Regional airline could be one that operates within one region, for example, the northwest corner of the United States. Many of these regional airlines, filled a niche. They were operated under Title 14 CFR Parts 135 and 298. However, the version of regional we'll look at in the next 4 episodes are airlines operating under Title 14 CFR 121 and 135. They contract with a major airline operating under Title 14 CFR Part 121. To be clear, what is considered a major airline? They are the airlines that have established routes and service customers who frequent that route system, such as United, Alaska, American, or Delta. Regional airlines were, at one time, independent airlines operating their own route system. Now they are codependent, contracted to the major airline. These regional airlines now operate within the major airlines system. This is a critical point. Major airlines grow at their own pace. Regionals do not. Delta establishes their routes based on Delta's forecast growth or business model. Delta chooses what airports to fly to. Delta's upper management makes decisions that affect Delta and its stockholders. Regionals do not choose the market they serve. They are subject to whatever market the major airline flies in. For instance, when American Airlines merged with US Air, American's regional airlines at the time didn't have a say in flying out of Charlotte, North Carolina. Instead, the regional airlines for American and US Air now had to negotiate their alliances with American alone. Major airlines choose the markets they grow to. Regionals do not. As mentioned earlier, regional airlines are operated under Part 121, which is domestic, flag, and supplemental operations, and Part 135, which is commuter and on-demand. Low-cost airlines like Southwest and AirTran flew airliners such as the B717 and the B737s into these smaller markets to monopolize on the financial benefits of these customers. They competed directly with the major airlines for their business. The disadvantage of low-cost airlines could be seen with Southwest's Midway Airport hub. Midway had limited airline traffic, while across the way, O'Hare was more convenient and had better connections. The majors and regionals entered symbiotic business relationships, beneficial to each other. The majors provided paying customers, and the regionals provided the smaller lift. Regional flights, operating under the major airlines' colors, fed passengers into the major airlines' hub and spoke system, providing customers with direct connections to international markets, both smaller and larger domestic markets. When both major and regional transitioned through the major airlines' hubs, passenger traffic moved smoothly through the major airlines system. One would think these hub and spoke regionals with major concepts would make travel easier. Yes, they did. But easier doesn't mean safer. The FAA's troubles were off in another direction. Major airline hubs soon became a wealth of aviation activity. The problem was the FAA was drastically understaffed to meet the growing number of changing oversight opportunities. Regional airlines were at the major airlines' hubs to meet the operation. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, different air operators at one location defied the FAA's rules, often by hiding in plain sight. Overseeing between 5 and 9 regional air operators, not including the major airlines operations, is overwhelming. As we will see in the next episodes, the regional FAA offices never worked together to simplify multiple discrepancies across numerous operators working as regionals for a major airline. In episodes 17 through 20, by reason of air safety, we'll analyze 4 airline accidents. The common denominator is all 4 accidents incurred to post-ADA regional carriers operating in a major airline system. What will become obvious as we analyze these accidents was the lack of attention these industries had. We will discover over the next 4 episodes 4 things. 1. The FAA, through complacency and poor upper management, has allowed post-ADA regionals and repair stations to dismiss their responsibilities. The FAA misunderstood these industries. 2. The NTSB, by employing probable cause and archaic investigatory processes, made the aviation industry vulnerable to unresolved accident sources by assuming what they didn't understand. 3. The U.S. Congress continues to interfere with the aviation industry. They first create the safety problems and then make matters worse by promoting lobbyists and special interests as non-solutions. And 4. Both regional airlines and repair stations have concealed from the FAA information critical to keeping them safe. That will start with the next episodes of By Reason of Air Safety. Until next time, I am Stephen Carbone reminding you to tab. Think safe, act safe, be safe. God bless.